Good afternoon. This is going to be a discussion of Drupal and Dungeons and Dragons. I will be your dungeon master, Tobby Hagler. I am a senior developer at Phase 2 Technology. It's a company based out of Alexandria, Virginia. A lot of developers are actually here in the area. I say here, as in within about a 4-hour drive of here. A lot of us here at Atlanta, Drupal Camp Atlanta. So why actually are we going to be talking about Dungeons and Dragons at a Drupal camp? I've had this question a lot. People are asking, what legitimate discussion can you actually have about Dungeons and Dragons at a Drupal camp? So if you need to write this down for your bosses, I'll go slow. This session, and this is going to be in the past tense, so it's easier to just hand this back. This session was an exploration of complex real-world data management issues and ways to solve them using Dungeons and Dragons as a point of reference for discussion. Yeah? I got to work real-world and Dungeons and Dragons in the same sentence, and it sounded legitimate. So, Drupal and D&D, what do they have in common? So, where do they actually intersect? So, managing and playing a D&D game, like many other real-world business needs, they've got a complex, it's a time-consuming and complex issue. Whether you're dealing with PC sheets or contract records, product or sales information, spec sheets, all of these things have unique challenges to managing workflows and how their data is stored. So this led to the D&D Character Module. It's available on Drupal.org for D7. So managing lots of PCs with paper can get daunting. A character sheet's complex and it takes a long time to fill out by hand. By the way, show of hands, who plays? Who's? Fourth edition or third? We're going to call this 3X. But it's applicable to 4. This particular module is for 3X. So about half the room, plays or played has played at one point, has played similar role-playing games. Yeah, years ago. Years ago, it's still fun. So you know what I'm talking about. Then filling out a paper character sheet can get pretty cumbersome. Every single piece of data, whether it's a weapon, a spell, it's got complex subunits of data. We're going to refer to that as compound data. And then finally, there just wasn't anything available on Drupal.org. So let me go back here. One of the things I wanted to point out here. So we're dealing with real-world data complexity issues. Difficult workflows that you have to codify, and most importantly, one of the common things that you hear over and over again: why does a contributed module exist? Well, somebody had that itch, and the module is a result of them having to scratch it. So going back to that's what this module ultimately was. It was scratching my own itch. I have managed several D&D campaigns over the last few years, and it's just easy for me to manage things online. It's easy to build something in Drupal, so I did. And I figured, while I had that need, I'm sure there was plenty of other people. Show of hands, who dungeon masters? Oh yeah, good number of people. Good. So yeah, it was useful for me to have something like this to manage the characters and keep track of everything and be able to print it out, a fresh sheet before every game. So that's scratched my own itch. So another valuable thing for me, anyway, building the D&D Character Module was actually a learning experience. So when I first created the module, Drupal 7 was just released. It was released January 5th, and I wrote the module like the next week. I'd already been using the features module. If anybody's familiar with using features, you can create a content type, export it, be able to create a whole module from it. So I'd already used that and was familiar with that, but what I really wanted to know was the big transition from going to CCK and Drupal 6 to the core Fields API in Drupal 7. So this gave me kind of an opportunity to learn the Fields API. So that was really kind of my underlying motive in building the module the way that I did.
So did Fields replace CCK?
Yes. So the CCK module lets you add fields to a node. You can create your content type. The Fields API was essentially just everything, the CRUD interface that was part of CCK, abstracted to a certain level and put into core Drupal 7. So that's what we were referring to when we say the Fields API. The short answer is Fields API for 7 is CCK for 6. So a lot of the things that I talk about here, even though it's Drupal 7 specific, do apply to Drupal 6. All the things that we can do here can actually be done and replicated in Drupal 6. So this was a chance for me to learn the Fields API while I was solving my other problem of how do I manage all these characters who are just tearing up goblins and orcs left and right and leveling up and constantly having to maintain new character sheets because we play with pencil and paper, but 3 or 4 runs into it, that piece of paper looks more like tissue paper. It's been erased so many times. So it's nice to be able to print out a new sheet before every game. So learning the Fields API, there's certain milestones that I think are pretty typical every time you learn any new thing, whether it's a new language, whether it's building your first module. It's always that first hello world, just outputting anything. So that's sort of the first milestone with anything. Then you get into messing with user submitted data. If you're doing something like command line programming using standard in. For PHP, it's messing with that get super global variable. The first time you mess with PHP, that's where you go to next. Then eventually it's connecting to databases, running queries, then being able to pull that data out and displaying it in some way that suits your needs. For me, the eventual milestone for learning anything is always building a new D&D character generator. So when I was in college and learning C and C++ for the first time, it was like, I kind of did sort of the assignments and then spent the rest of my time in the lab putting together a D&D character generator. The first time I learned Perl, I was, playing around with command line. Same thing with CGI, being able to build a form and build a web version of the same character generator that I'd been building for years in other languages. So it's a common reference point for me when I'm learning something new. So that answers the question of where do D&D and Drupal intersect. Actually go pretty well together. Even got somebody at the office to print up some of these sweet shirts. So that's where the D&D Character Module was born. It's a suite of 3 modules. The D&D Character Module itself, which is a features package of a content type for a player character. The second is D&D Fields, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's defines several compound fields for using in the D&D character. And then finally the D&D Character Sheet, which is a module that generates some PDF. So let's get back to the data management issue at hand. And this is something that applies pretty much in every other aspect of Drupal development at some point. But so D&D data management, what have we got? So you've got PC information, obviously. You've got the character's race. That's going to have certain special abilities and penalties. If you're human, you get bonus feats. Class, you've got skills that come along with that, special abilities. You may have spells or certain limitations that are applied. You might actually be multi-class. So that's even further data management thing that you have to consider. Skills, you might be that might be a class skill or a cross-class skill. You have to pay attention to how many ranks a character buys with it, and so on. Feats and attributes, ability scores, saving throws. How do you keep track of all of that? I mean, in the context of Drupal with standard fields, sometimes it just doesn't seem to go along with it. So then you have other things entirely. Spells. Spells have components. They have spellcraft feats can extend or enlarge the abilities of a spell. Your equipment might have special attributes. It might be magical. It might be cursed. It might be masterwork. Your animal companions. If you have someone who's playing a druid, a ranger, they're going to have animals, little critters running around and helping out. But you have to maintain certain things about them. Their hit dice, their hit points, their experience. It's almost like a little mini character. NPCs, their backstories, what have they been doing since the last time the players have met them, and so on. So you have all of these different things to manage in a D&D campaign. So looking at the data management problems we actually have to solve, narrowing it down to just a few things we want to focus on. You have lots of fields. Your character has a lot of data points associated with it. So you have to figure out ways to manage those fields. Compound fields, and I'll go into this a little bit more in a second. And then being able to output that data. I said at the beginning, it's one thing to be able to pull data out of the database, but it's another thing entirely to be able to display that in a useful and meaningful way. So nodes and standard fields. Nodes is pretty much the go-to data bundle in Drupal 7. Well, actually every version of Drupal, but in Drupal 7 specifically, it's referred to as a bundle. And does everybody know what a bundle is? No? Maybe a few of you? So essentially, the data units in Drupal 7, you have entities. And then you can make those entities fieldable. They become fields. A bundle is a collection of fields, so a bundle can refer to a node, a user, a taxonomy term, whatever you feel like it can refer to. Anything that's a collection of fields is essentially a bundle. So the node is the go-to bundle in Drupal for almost anything if you're collecting large pieces of data. So let's examine what we could actually do with the standard fields that come with Drupal. So you have the character's name. Easy enough, right? I mean, that's usually the first place we start. It's a string. Yeah, fine. Easy enough. All right, moving on, you've got the character's race. Yeah, that's another string. But you start having to worry about things like the fact that a character's race is going to affect the ability scores. Well, it's fine if you're playing a human, but if you play an elf, then your dexterity might have decreased increased. But your constitution decreases, because they're frail little critters. So the class, again, a string, but you have the added complexity of dealing with multi-class characters, and you might not have the same number of levels per class. So it's starting to get a little hairy. Well, attributes, okay, so those are integers, easy enough. You set your integer range from 3 to 18, or maybe from 0 to 20, or 0 to 30 if you're playing epic level stuff. But then you have to worry about bonuses and temporary modifiers to those scores, and then it's we'll deal with that later. And then it just starts breaking down when you start looking at skills, because those might be integers, they might be strings. They could be checkboxes, but you have maybe 60 skills if you're playing out of the core handbook, or maybe 120 or 160, depending on how many more rule sets you start adding. Plus, you might have a couple of house rules that apply. And feats, again, it's just a checkbox, but then you have to worry about prerequisites, and you have the ability scores, you have the other feats that you need for greater cleave or something like that. And then weapons, oh yeah. At that point, it's just gotten completely out of hand. So it's obvious that standard fields they're not enough. They're not enough. So regardless of the data type, your data using standard fields, API fields, they're name value pairs. At the end of the day, regardless of it being a string, an integer, a float, whatever, just a name value pair. Now you can create multiple values, but that doesn't really give you multiple keys. And so what I mean by multiple values, every time you create a content type, you see the number of values of this sum field here. You can choose, it's 1, it's 2, it's 6, it's unlimited. That's great, but it's pretty one-dimensional. So multiple values, it's vertical, but it's not horizontal. Now, before I go on, do you know what I'm talking about when I say vertical versus horizontal data depth? So with vertical, some folks look like you know, but for those that don't, vertical essentially just refers to the fact that we're stacking multiple values on top of the same field. You have, for instance, your character's weapons list. You've got a long sword, a short sword, a gauntlet, and a mace. Okay, yeah, that kind of helps. Yes, exactly. So to illustrate the horizontal depth that you need, you have these other attributes of the weapons list, right? So suddenly that longsword, oh, that's a masterwork, so it's a +1, right? You've got additional attributes that you need to keep track of. Your short sword, that's a +2 versus goblin. It's magical. It's enchanted. The gauntlet, it's just a regular gauntlet. No special attributes, but the fields are there if you need them. And the mace, yeah, it's one thing if it's just a mace, but what if it's a mace of terror? I mean, what's the difference, honestly, between a mace and a mace of terror? Well, other than a 60-foot cone of fear, that's yeah. So now you see the difference in vertical and horizontal depth. That horizontal depth, there are these additional fields that you need to be able to capture these additional attributes. Whether it's the color, it's the monetary value, if it's the even if it's just product descriptions, that's where you have the need for horizontal depth. So that was the second problem I needed to solve in managing characters in a Drupal environment. So I created the D&D Fields module that goes along with it. So this is really where I got into playing around with the Fields API. So remember when I was talking earlier about the need to use a common reference point, something I'm already familiar with when I'm learning something new. Well, this was exactly that. So having something that I could already see how it should behave. I actually kind of just sat down, in one sitting one night and put together this module and started producing additional compound fields for D&D. So now, abilities are no longer just a single stack of integers. Here there's actually some depth to what we see here. So to store complex horizontal data, you're going to have compound fields. So yeah, sure, the modifier of the ability score can be derived. I mean, everybody knows you take the ability score, divide that by 2, round down, because you always round down in D&D. It's not fair, but that's the way it goes. And then subtract 5, and that's how you derive the modifier of these abilities, unless you're playing a heroic campaign. Some people have heroic rules where your class's primary ability gets an extra 2 points applied to the modifier. So in that case, that's not something that you can derive anymore because you don't really know that. So you need the ability to record the modifier. And again, if you've been cursed, if you've been hastened, you may have temporary scores along with temporary modifiers that go along with it. So it's a lot easier now to capture all of that in one field. Each one of these is just one more field. So this is now what it looks like when you're creating a D&D character node that already comes with the D&D character module. But this is what it looks like when you're defining that. So let's take a look, for instance, the D&D armor field. So you when you're dealing with compound fields, you have the field itself, you have the widget. So going back to just talking about Fields API in general, Fields API has field info, schemas, widgets, and formatters. Just four elements to it. So widgets are what we refer to as the form input. It's just HTML forms that users input their data. And then the formatters are the output. It's how that field gets displayed. And so here we're selecting the D&D armor field, and then in the next column you'll see the D&D armor values widget is it's the only thing that's selectable, but that's what is going on there. So Fields API in 3 easy steps. Step 1, you just have to tell Drupal about the field. You're defining a new field, and you're going to do that with hook field info. You may need to define the schema. This is the same exact thing as hook schema when you're doing anything else with the Drupal module. It's just hook field schema. It's the database schema that's going to hold the data that you capture. And then hook validate, hook is empty. Those are things that I'm not really going to go into here because it's kind of tedious. The second step is accepting user input. You need something that's going to capture the user input. That's what these 2 widgets are. You've got an info hook that defines the widget, and then a form function that's just going to accept the form. It's just Fields API all over again, just reduced down to the smaller arena of dealing with a field. The third and final step to building something using Fields API is the output. You just need to be able to output that data. It's one thing to collect the data, but you have to be able to output it. Now, I've listed 8 hooks that are essential to defining a field. I know that sounds, like, 8 hooks. He said it was 3 easy steps. Yeah. I kind of fudged the numbers a little bit, but whatever. I'm a DM. I can kind of change the rules as I go along. So, looking at the first step to creating a new field, it's hook field info, and this is exactly that. It's just an associative array. You're just defining the array that has some additional information about the field that you're going to define later. You're telling it, what is my default widget? What is my default formatter? Those are really the only things we care about. Everything else is just text displayed to the user. So it's actually really simple. Most of your hooks are going to be like this. They're going to be info hooks, not really much to it. So once we've defined that, then you go on to defining your widget. That's not good. The Mac just turned off. Bear with me 1 second. Let me plug in. Oh, is there? Yeah, there is. Look at that. Somebody was more prepared than me. That'll be interesting, trying to assemble the screen capture from this. So what I was showing you before was the widget. The widget is essentially just a form API definition of the form that you want to capture all those additional data points. And so in the first step of telling Drupal about the field, what we did was we defined the info, and then later in a slide that I'm not actually showing you here, you define the schema. The schema, for a weapon is going to have the title of the weapon, the damage that it does, its crit range, any additional information like the magical bonuses that might apply to it, any kind of comment like that. So all that gets stored in the database. So in order for it to store it in the database, you define a schema. That's just a hook filled schema.
So considering that data type is so complex, what is really the main advantage of that versus having a completely separate entity for the weapon?
Well, that's a good question. So the question was, if it's so complex, why don't you just create a new entity for it? Well, that's essentially what we're doing. We're defining this through the Fields API, which creates an entity. It's still an entity. It just has additional hooks that lets you display the form data to the user for input. That's
I guess you could pull it out as separate, isolated.
right. The other reason that I suggest going with the Fields API and defining it as a full-fledged field is that way it's exportable easily along with the node through features, and you can reuse the same fields, and you can, arguably do the exact same thing with entities, but I would argue that using the Field API to define all this is, even though it's creating an entity and then stacking fields on top of it, field forms on top of it, actually is a lot easier to just manage it through the Field API.
Have you seen the greater performance in Drupal 7 so we feel in the way that Drupal 7 has implemented fields?
Yeah, because so for one thing, you've got everything that's spread out, every single field is spread out into a separate table, and then you've got all these inner joins that have to rebuild, but that's actually not the data management problem I was trying to solve.
That's a good point as to why you might do it as a field as opposed to, because you can do it as an entity in a couple of different ways, right? You say, well, I'm just going to make a new node type that represents monomer and
Well,
attach
something like that,
right, attach all the fields there and the node reference, right? You can say, I'm going to do a real entity with a real database table.
Okay, well, the real schema, that isn't always so much fields.
Right, but then you still have to create you either have to create a field so that you can reference that new entity to your character node, or you have to particularly use something like the relation module, or I think there's an entity reference now as well to mark which one belongs, which piece of armor belongs to it. I think that would actually be one of the things over the next year that people try to figure out with Drupal 7 is, okay, when should be a field, when should be an entity.
It sounds like
Well, you have to
how much
entities
work.
essentially if you build an entity with this, because an entity, you can create your entire database schema and never even use fields.
Right.
Yeah, you can.
Which is nice, because you can use the system very much for like flavor, but you have to do, you have to go through integrate with it, and there's a lot of work with going through, and I think there is a lot of development that will actually take, that does actually make it to where it will take those question forms from entities.
Yeah, and if you want to keep things very performant, you can even go one step further and create a custom form that saves to a custom table and bypass the entities altogether, and you just kind of do this like you would have in Drupal 6 or even Drupal 5, where you build a form, let people fill it out. It saves all of that data in a database table, so it's it's normalized. It would be be a lot more performant than any kind of relational Fields API database. I mean, there are really a lot of ways to go about doing it. The problem I was trying to solve here was, one, manage my D&D campaign where there's 5 of us playing at any one point, and so performance isn't really a concern. And then 2, just to learn the Fields API.
So when performance is a big issue, I mean, you seem pretty knowledgeable about the field.
Yeah. So
when performance is an issue, I mean, would you kind of stray away from fields in Drupal 7 and build out entities instead in custom tables?
it would depend on the project. It would be a consideration. Yes, it would definitely be a consideration. If I have something like the
Grading performance is worth it or not? Because I mean, that's a lot of work in comparison to going through and just using fields, using Drupal fields.
Right. Yeah. So to that point, so the question really is would I still take this approach if I was dealing with a site that had a lot of traffic? So the short answer is maybe not. But in this particular case, traffic's not a concern. But if it was a concern and I was using the same approach, I would be having to look at things like, do I have good caching in front of all this? 9 times out of 10, I would be serving this as anonymous traffic anyway, so I could use Varnish or CDN or something to put in front of that. Not something I've really considered, in this, but
We're here, you seem pretty knowledgeable, I want to know.
But the short answer to your question of the Fields API, does it create performance issues? Yes, it does.
I mean, I've looked at it, I've built some things within this realm, and that's one of the things I see is as, I mean, I look at companies with version Drupal 6 right now, but as we move to Drupal 7, I think that's something to very much look at, maybe not use Google to do a lot of traffic.
Yeah.
You can also swap out your field storage engine.
What?
You can swap out your field storage engine and not do it.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Have any of y'all done that with like a CouchDB or a MongoDB? Because it seems like
Yes.
those sort of NoSQL databases would be very useful for.
they are. The MongoDB module for Drupal 7, and I think it does this for Drupal 6. The MongoDB module for Drupal 7 does let you, it lets you take all of the fieldable data and store that as Mongo documents in a Mongo database. Very, very performant. To give you an idea of the performance difference that you can run into between a relational database like MySQL and a document storage database like Mongo, MySQL defaults for what's considered a slow query, something that's going to show up in the slow query log, is 10 seconds. A MongoDB slow query by default is 100 milliseconds. So that's sort of the expectation that, yeah, Mongo should be, but also Mongo's not a relational database, so it's got some advantages there that it's storing documents and serving those out of memory. So that is one of the reasons why using something like a different field storage engine like MongoDB or CouchDB is going to buy you some performance.
We have relational database and never the greatest idea in the first place.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Use a actual meta storage system, meta storage.
yeah. The only difference is, going to something like that is that your relational, the relationships you define between the data sets are stored in code versus in, spread out by the database. So it's, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul in some aspects. But also, in addition to that, just one more side note about MongoDB module. You can also use things like you can use Mongo as a replacement for Memcache, so that if you find that Memcache is a little bit buggy for you, it is for some people, especially if you're dealing with it in Drupal 7 and you're not running the exact latest version of Memcache-D and all this. It can be kind of buggy. So MongoDB might also be a good replacement for your Memcache as well. Because you can store all the cache as Mongo documents, and it's keeping it in cache and in memory, so it's pretty fast. So those are ways, going back to how can you make this perform. That's a really good suggestion, Ken. Thanks. Anyway, so I kind of want to get back on track here. So we're talking about ability scores. Wanting some data depth here. Again, with compound fields. The 3 easy steps. We've defined our info array just to define the widget and the formatter relationship. So here's actually then the field widget before my awesome Mac died, which wasn't that the lesson that we learned in the keynote this morning that Macs suck? Or people using Macs at critical, I don't know. There's something there. I can make a joke. I'm not going to. It's not going to be that funny anyway. So the field widget. This is what we're defining here. So this was. I'm not going to show you the code because it's kind of incomprehensible to show on a slide. It's about 100 lines. But what we've got here is Forms API within a hook field widget. Function. It's just standard form API that corresponds to the names of the fields defined in the field schema hook that we defined previously. So that's all it is. So here, just kind of going back to the screen here, you can see another example. This is one field that's been defined to accept 6 values. Whereas this one has been defined to take an infinite number of values. So that's why you see 1, and then you can click add another item, and then you just keep doing that infinitely, or until your gold runs out. So the third step So what am I talking about with a field formatter? So a field formatter, it's just a hook that lets you define the output of your field. So in this case, this is just the rendered HTML of the field data. Actually, all I'm doing here, this is just using theme table. I take all of the individual components of the field, and each row of the table is one field. And each row, each one of those cells is all the compounded data that gets stored in the database as defined by hook field schema. So moving on from field formatters, even then, field formatters may not be enough because we've captured the data points that we want. Node templates, you can define a node template to really do what you want to do. It's fine for on-screen display. You want to kind of get a glance of how your character's doing. You know, does it have enough hit points to go on this run? Do I have enough gold saved up yet to buy the Rod of Resurrection that I'm going to really need soon? Yeah, watch out. So that's great for on-screen display. But when you need to print forms for records, HTML and CSS, they just don't cut it. I don't care how good you are with HTML and CSS, it just doesn't do the trick. Well, for one, if you have something like a background color on your header with white text, suddenly you're printing white text on a white sheet of paper. Browsers are not going to print backgrounds, for instance. So that's why I say it's just not going to cut it. So output of your complex data, it's essential to good data management. So in the case of D&D, or any tabletop role-playing games that uses pencil and paper, you need to be able to print that out. So I mean, you've got iPad apps that are great for managing characters, but nothing, and I mean nothing, beats paper for playing tabletop D&D. As a computer guy who makes his living on the internet, looking at a computer all day, paper is still king. So the third module then in this suite of modules is the D&D Character Sheet module. So what it does, this is sort of the thing that we're trying to solve here now. You've got different character sheets that you can print out. You can photocopy. You have actual permission from Wizards of the Coast to print out these character sheets from the back of the player's handbook. You can get online. You can build your own. Printing something out that's tangible is the problem that we're trying to solve here. So, it's one thing to be able to capture all of that, all of those data points about your character in a fieldable way. And being able to manipulate the fields, it's just as important to be able to print that out in something that makes sense on paper. So, Drupal and PDF output. That's an interesting topic. You could probably do an entire session or a BOF just on that. So node templates, they just generate HTML, CSS. It doesn't matter. I mean, if it's XHTML, HTML5, you can do some really cool stuff. But it's it's really still kind of just HTML. I kind of mentioned that printable CSS and HTML is still not great, and you can define different style sheets for print, but it's still not going to do what you want. The print module that's available for D6 and D7 does really good stuff. If you're dealing with stuff that with output that doesn't have to be exact. But all that's doing is really taking the HTML and CSS generated and turning that into a PDF document for you. So it doesn't really buy you a whole lot in this particular case. So let me be clear, the print module is great for 95% of all problems you want to solve with being able to generate PDFs, but this is in that 5 or even 1% edge case. So whether it's a PC sheet, a product spec sheet, a tax record, you've all looked at these forms that you have to fill out, at the DMV, wherever, and it's pretty exact. I mean, the specifications of just the sheet itself is pretty exact. So that's really where probably 80% of the time was spent developing this whole D&D Character Management System was generating PDF. This is actually using PDFlib to generate PDFs. So you have to have this installed for PHP, but it usually comes with most servers now. So to start off with, what we're doing in this sample of code, because I'm not going to go into the whole thing, because PHP is ugly. Looking at it is ugly. It's hard to follow. But what we're doing here, we've got to first set up the page dimensions. In this case, we're doing this for just standard, standard U.S. letter size. You could do legal if you want. You could do A1 if you're in the UK. But you have to define the paper size, the canvas size. You have to set the margins on the page. And then you have to go and define each one of those cells in your character sheet one by one by one by one and so on. And then once you've got those defined, print those out and then print the node data, the field data, back into those cells. So assuming you're happy now with the actual sheet itself, printing the fielded data out, it's actually pretty simple. So this function right here, I mean, it's not much, it's about 30 lines of code that generates the wealth box on your character sheet. I mean, that's really all we're planning for anyway, right?
Your objective here is
Go.
to just complete that PDF form,
Mm-hmm.
that canned PDF form.
Right.
Fill in the blanks.
Yep, and yeah, once you've defined the form itself, once you've drawn all the coordinates to generate the cells, all the blocks, all the all your headers, then yeah, at that point we're just going through, because now we know the coordinates of each one of those cells. We can drop the data, the fields in, just like you're doing with any other custom node template. So yeah, that's exactly that's all we're doing here. So what we have in this slide is actually a screenshot of a PDF generated from an existing node. Obviously, no DM in their right mind would let you have a character with a charisma of 25, so it's obviously test data. But entering in the node information just through the regular node form to create your character, to edit them later. Every time you level up, you go back and edit the same form. You can actually turn on revisions if you want to kind of charge characters progress. So that's another little data management trick. And then just go and print out your character sheet, and you're ready to go. So you've spent maybe 5 minutes updating your character sheet rather than having to go and look up all of the rules every time you level up. Like, oh, hey, I've reached 4th level. I get another ability score. Where's that going to go? Things like that. So that was the problem we were trying to solve with being able to generate PDFs. It's actually, once you spend 90% of your time defining how the sheet's going to be laid out, then it's just a matter of plugging in your fieldable data. So that's enough about the actual D&D module. But the one last thing about using Drupal for D&D that I really like, so you can manage your entire campaign. If you're a player, it's one thing to be able to manage your character. That's cool and nice. But as a dungeon master, it's also good to be able to know that you can use Drupal to manage your entire campaign, just like you would information about your business, to make product information available to potential customers. It's the exact same thing. It honestly really is. You're just, at this point, you're just managing additional metadata that doesn't really change. So in this case, we're going to manage campaign history, the pantheon of your guides. You might create a page for NPCs, because they don't need as complex data storage as you do for the PCs. But you might have blog posts to cover all your additional runs. And so really, what is a CMS? I mean, it's a campaign management system, right? So like I said, you're running every time after we play. I like to go and blog what actually happened as sort of a historical record. Kind of gives people a chance to relive, like previously on D&D. You can read the last blog post. So you can create custom pages to cover things like artifacts and kingdom information, and be able to store all that stuff in a place that makes sense, online. and even kind of get into almost like a wiki formatted approach. So, what it might look like this, where you have the blog roll is really the kind of the main focus, but you can click on the characters and be able to print off character sheets directly from the website. You can look up information about other NPCs, the deities that are involved, depending on what your campaign is like. So, in summary, we've looked at using Fields API for building compound fields, and that's really, really cool to be able to go from this sort of like vertical only approach to storing data to now it's vertical and horizontal. You can capture additional data points. Being able to produce PDFs, it's time consuming and tedious, but it's one of those things you have to do once, hopefully. And then being able to remember that Drupal's a content management system. You can apply the same approach really to any other piece of data that you're trying to store. One of the cool things about defining all of these compound fields is that you can use them over and over again. So I've got a player character content type. Well, now I want an NPC content type that might use the abilities, the spells, and the skills that are those same fields that exist for the PC character, but I don't need all the others. I don't need to know like all of his wealth and I don't, all of that extra biographical information. So the fact that Drupal as a CMS, it will let you manage all that extra data. You can reuse a lot of the fields, which is also another one of the benefits of using this as fields. One of the performance downsides is that all this data is reusable. One of the upsides is all this data is reusable. So, and just to give you a couple of helpful resources, on Agile Approach, I actually have a blog entry where I give you a complete how-to on creating compound fields for D7. I promise you, I'll somewhere on here I've got a link to a D6 blog post that talks about this too. But if you're interested in learning more about how to create a compound fields specifically, and actually use the D&D Fields module as an example, and you can see every single hook, all the schema definitions, the form definitions, and everything. That's available. You can also download the D&D Character Module just to see what it does, and hopefully, if if you're a player or a dungeon master, it's helpful for you to run your campaign. And then finally, of course, api.drupal.org. You can just type in underscore field underscore something, and it'll autocomplete. You can look up most of the hooks that are related to it. If you're really interested in learning more about Fields API in general and not just compound fields, look at the field example module that comes with Drupal 7. It's not turned on by default, but it's basically a color picker. So it's just storing simple RGB values, but it defines an extra widget to let you use a color dropper to pick colors. And so it's a good example at something completely non-geeky, sort of non-geeky, to just another approach to learning the Fields API. So those are some good resources that I would recommend if you're interested in learning more about Fields API and some of that. So any questions? Yes.
Will your deck be on the Drupal camp?
Yes, it will. Also on Agile Approach, we'll probably post it there, and a host of other places. But yes, you should be able to find it here within a few days, and be able to look at the slide deck.
I'll send you an email so you can send me that link.
Yeah. In fact, I've got business cards up here. If you want that kind of stuff, feel free to shoot me an email. And the gentleman over here had a question.
I have for us heretics like 4th editions.
Yeah, you guys, yeah.
How difficult would it be to adapt the D&D character modules for, D&D 4 or possibly like some other, role-playing system entirely?
Yeah, so whether you play 4th edition or GURPS or any of those things. So this is an interesting little sidestep, but one of the very first issue queue things that I had about the module was, hey, you called your character type character. Well, what if, the rest of us want to play 4th Ed, or we want to play D20 Modern or GURPS. So I renamed the character content type that gets generated to D&D Character. Maybe I should have called it D&D 3 Character. But the point is, there's this interesting little thing called kit compliance. I don't know that it's really taken off, but essentially it's a kind of a namespace declaration for Drupal development. So you would always name your character content type D&D Character, because that's what it is. And then you could come along and create D&D 4 Character. You can create GURPS Character, right? So if you wanted to take something like this, you could actually clone the content type, make the changes that you want to it, export that as a feature with a content type called D&D 4 Character. And because I tried to follow kit compliance in the way everything was named, all the fields are very much specific to D&D. Well, I'm sorry, let me back up. The fields that are specific to D&D are named D&D Character. And so you can mimic those fields and call them something else, like you might call it character name, and that field can be applied to both a D&D character and a GURPS character. You can I'm trying to think off the top of my head some of the difference in character data fields that you would have between 3 and 4.
But it just didn't seem like it would be something where you could do like the libraries API, where you can just plug in different types of game system.
Yeah. So this module is the actual core itself is just a feature defined content type. So to your point of it's not very pluggable for other types of characters. Sure, it's good within the same playing system. Like if you wanted to create a character versus an animal companion versus an NPC, you could reuse the same fields over and over again and just rearrange them in different ways and have different content types. But if you wanted to reuse the same thing for 4th Ed or for another playing system, another game system entirely, yeah, you're right. It's not very pluggable in that way. So one approach might be to define some generic fields. So you have one module that defines generic fields like character name, character class, whatever, and then be able to. So I know where I'm going with that. So you would define character class as a field, and then you can have pluggable default values. So let me back up here. It's actually a little ways. Yeah. So here you're dealing with the 6 standard ability scores that every D&D character has. So this is a single field. It's a compound field. So it has the score, the modifier. It actually has the ability name as part of the field itself. And then it's defined within the feature to say, hey, it's this is actually 6 fields. Like before, you could select, 1 or many or infinite. This is set to 6 by default, and there's some additional functionality that does some hook form alters in my hook field widget that adds those default values. So to your point about making this something that's extensible by other modules, you might actually have only the field that gets defined, and then you can have the other module that you want to turn on, like, hey, this is a Dungeons and Dragons 4th Ed, this is 3.5, this is 3.0. You can actually define some of the pre-populated data. The same is true, by the way, with skills. So the module predefines, I think, 160 different skills. Includes, Player's Handbook 2, Psionic rules, some other, like house rules and odds and ends. A lot of things that come in the SRD 3.5 MySQL database. That's where a lot of that stuff got pulled from. So you could do something like that where you define the skill field, but then have another module that then just pre-populates the default values. Because just like with every other Drupal field, when you're defining the field, you can actually say, hey, I want these items to be the default values that you can choose from. So you now have a select. Like I want to choose. Might be good to maybe show a live demo, maybe of some of the other fields that we've got going on to better illustrate that point. But so you have a select box that lists all of the skills next to a text box to let you type in how many skill ranks you want to apply to it. So depending on the game that you're playing, you might do something like, I want to use these set of skills for D&D 3.5. I want to use these skills for 4th Ed. I want to use these skills for GURPS, and if I'm playing Star Wars, then that doesn't even apply. So that might be how you approach multiple games using kind of the same fields functionality. Let's see if I can get out here. Yeah, maybe not, because I'm trying to do a live demo. It's always going to roll a 1. So anyway, I can actually send you a link or you can download the module and play with it. But you'll see what I mean with the ability to you just go and create a node. It's as simple as node add D&D character. But you'll see that you can. If you go and actually edit the content type itself, you'll see that a lot of these things have pre-populated default values. And so all the skills, all the feats, the 6 ability scores, all those things are kind of predefined along with the fields. So. All right. Yeah, so naturally. I don't know the PowerPoint. I didn't take that feat. So I don't know, does anybody else have any more questions? Thoughts? Suggested improvements? All right, so contact information. Feel free if you do have more questions, if you want to talk about Fields API, if you want to talk about PDF, if you want to talk about D&D. Here's my contact information. I also have business cards up here at the front. If you want me to send you some links, I can. And these slides will be available just in here in a couple of days, not only on agileapproach.com, which is Phase 2's blog, but also from the Drupal camp. And hopefully this video will work out with the Mac dying halfway through. So we'll see. Maybe the second half will be available. Who knows? All right. Thank you very much.